Welcome to the Podcast Interview Marketing Show, where we explore big ideas with leading experts on how to grow your brand and business with targeted podcast interviews.
When Interview Valet began in 2015, podcasting was still young, but we saw great potential in its ability to leverage other people's audiences by expanding your reach, gaining SEO, and building authority through affiliation. An idea that quickly evolved into the podcast interview marketing system that we know and use today. For nearly a decade, we have collected data on everything we do and are proud to share those findings every year in what has become our most anticipated and downloaded resource, the state of podcast guesting. We are proud to share our findings with the podcast community so that we may all grow better together. On this special episode, you will hear from our founder and CEO, Tom Schwab. He will share his findings from the 2024 State of Podcast Guesting. He will share this year's findings, emerging trends, and future predictions for podcast guesting. You can easily capture everything you need from listening to this episode, but you can also watch it on our Interview Valet YouTube channel, and that will help you follow along with the corresponding graphs and charts.
So here we go. The State of Podcast Guesting 2024, right? And let me first start out with of what this is and what this isn't. Right. So this is all the data that we collected over the last year. Right. We collect a lot of data with over 1,500 clients on over 75,000 podcast interviews. We've got data points on each one, and we keep those all in our proprietary database, and we sift through that. So the numbers that I'm showing you here are for podcasts that are mostly, well, all, in that business category. We really work with professional services. We work with with alternative investments, high-level coaches, consultants. All of the podcasts we work with also are in the top 20% based on downloads. So I don't know that these numbers hold for comedy podcasts or if they hold out for podcasts that are in the bottom half. I'm just showing you the numbers and the data that we have. And what I always do is call people and say, if you've got different data, please share this with the world so that we can all learn together. So jumping into this, I'd like to thank Alex over at PodPros. He put out some data and he's sharing his data here. One of the things I want to say is that podcast guesting has gotten a whole lot more competitive, right? We've seen this when we first started to do this. I could tell you that there was 4, maybe 5 agencies that did podcast placement. And now it seems like they're popping up all over, but also the guests are popping up all over. And Alex's numbers showed that there's about 100,000 podcasts, this is English based, that are looking for guests. Well, right now there's 2.6 million guests looking to be on podcast. So where it used to be a double-sided marketplace, lots of podcasts, few guests, now it's about 22, 23 guests per podcast. So not only do you have to be a better guest, you have to stand out a whole lot more. It's not as easy for the podcast host or the podcast guest. So with that in mind, one of the things that we look for is, well, how do people connect, right? And one of the things that I think you'll see in here is that the term podcast has largely changed, right? There's a technical definition of a podcast. And when it first started out, it was, an RSS feed, audio only. But boy, that was 20 years ago. Today, podcasts are on YouTube. They're on Sirius XM. You can find some of them that are put out on terrestrial radio. I think of Stacking Benjamins with Joe Saul Seahigh, right? That's owned by Podcast One, that also owns a company called Westwood One that syndicates it to all the radio stations out there. So they're repurposing them. Podcast has gotten to be so much bigger of a term there. And the platforms have changed also. And when people say, well, what kind of platform, if I'm going to be on a guest, how do they record? Well, today more than ever, when you say a podcast, it means Zoom. And this has changed drastically since pre-COVID. So in just what, 4 years? 4 years ago, podcasts meant getting on Skype. And it's changed so much now, right? Now, 70% of the podcasts are done over Zoom, right? Because everybody knows how to do Zoom. We're all comfortable with it, but it's changing and it's changing quickly. And just the same way we went from 70% Skype to less than 1% on Skype, I'm seeing this major shift to platforms that are recording locally, right? And there's some out there. Riverside, Zencaster, Squadcast that was bought by Descript, even StreamYard, where they are recording locally and then pushing it up to the internet. So it doesn't matter if you've got a bad internet connection, either on the host or the guest side, it doesn't matter because they'll record it locally and then push it up there. So think about this as you're looking at your podcast or being a guest on podcasts. Make sure that you're comfortable with things like Riverside, with Zencaster. If you're going on a podcast interview for the first time, make sure you check that out. If anything, I think they're even easier to use because over the last, 4 years, it seems like Zoom keeps adding bells and whistles. And every time I look at it, something's changed. So if you look at this, how it's changed over time, right? Yeah, it's still a majority of Zoom, but you look at the ones that are growing. It's the people and the platforms that are doing video and doing local recording. And really, that's where we see everything going to. The other thing is that people will sometimes ask us, well, when are podcasts recorded? Right. And I think of someone, I talked to him earlier this week. Great guest, but he also happens to be a state senator. And he's like, yeah, I can't book anything Monday through Friday when we're in session because you could get called away. I'm like, well, really, podcasts today are more of a midweek thing, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And this has changed so much from during COVID. During COVID, any day that ended in a Y was a good day for a podcast. Now it's really midweek. And it's funny, when we drill down into the days here, that 0.3%, excuse me, yeah, 0.3% that are done on Sunday, that's Sunday, the guest time. So those were typically people in the States in North America, our clients that were doing podcasts in Australia. So Australia Monday for us on Sunday. The other thing is we look at it as getting more competitive. There's also a bigger wait time now. And I have to explain this a lot of times to new clients that they think podcast is like radio or television, right? I'll get invited today, record it tomorrow, and everybody will hear it. I always say podcasts are more like print media, where there's an editorial calendar, where there's a lead time to it. And this lead time has gone up. It's actually gone up 5 days over the last year. So I'm talking about the time between when you invite and when you when you introduce yourself to the time you get invited. And then that time between when you get invited to when you actually record it. And then the time from recording to it going live. So let's drill down on each one of these. The average time from introduction to invitation in our experience is 5 calendar days, right? There's always some outliers on there. There's some people that say yes right away, but the mean time is 5 days. And that's one of those things that I point out to people that if they're out there pitching themselves or other agencies that are out pitching, and I hate that word, right? We use introduction, not pitching. If you haven't heard back in, a week or 2 weeks, no answer is probably the answer. Where we're getting these ones that are further out is when we're introducing a new client and then they come back and say, oh yeah, I didn't get back to you, but Tiffany Mink would be a great client, great invitation, right? I'd love to have her on the podcast. So just think about that. Podcasters are seeing your emails, and if they're not responding, that's probably an answer right there. And especially as it's getting more competitive, right? 22 guests for every eligible podcast. Podcasters really want to have three types of people: their friends, their friends of friends, and people they want to be their friends. So when people work through us as an agency, they're tapping into our relationships. That's that friends of friends. And as you're positioning yourself, or we position our clients, we always want to make it look like somebody that the host would enjoy having a relationship with and really introducing to their audience. So this is the average time, 5 days between introduction and invitation. Now let's jump between invitation to recording. The mean time on that is 43 days. That's up substantially, almost 11 days since last year. So what we're seeing on this, it means that the best podcasts are scheduled further out. The best guests don't have the flexibility in their calendar. So it might take them on mean 43 days to connect and record. I think I said it before, right? The best podcasts are like doctors' offices and restaurants, right? If there's not a wait, there's a reason, and a reason you don't want to be there. The more flexible you can be, the quicker you can be on there. And I always remind people, you're the guest, right? So you need to be flexible, work around the host schedule whenever possible. So think about it. It was 5 days between from introduction to getting invited, another 43 days from the being invited to recording. And then we jump into recording to going live. This one actually surprised me. It went down last year. Well, it used to be at about 42 days. Last year, the mean time was about 35 days on this. So just know that there's some podcasts that are live, right? News podcasts. We don't work with them, so they're not in the mix here. We're talking more about interview style, big picture items, big picture strategic topics. There's a editorial calendar, and people are taking time to edit these, to repurpose them. So pretty much figure that you've got about 35 days between when it records and goes live. And actually, that can help you. I think of the late, great Dan Miller. I always would tell the story that he was on a podcast. And in the middle of the podcast, he got this idea for a new download. And he said, we've got this download, 48 low or no cost ideas, business ideas. And Dan wrote a book called 48 Days to the Work You Love. Well, at the end of the podcast, the host said, oh, I'd love to see that download. And Dan said, well, heavens, I would too. I just had the idea for it. And he knew that he had some time to create that and put that up there. So we talked about, the competitiveness, that the different platforms and how long it's taking. But one of the themes that you've heard me say here is video. And it's interesting that pre-COVID, less than 1 in 5 podcasts included video, right? It was less than 20%. Remember when COVID hit and we were all sort of trying to figure out how to use Zoom, and there were people that never had done the video portion? And boy, fast forward now, it's just become the standard. Videos become the standard with the platforms, with the technology, with the bandwidth. So I always tell people now, if you are on a podcast, just assume the video is going to be on there. Now, they may or may not use the video when they release it, but I really think it makes for a better conversation. You can pick up on those nonverbals, right? If they pick up their drink to say something, you don't throw it right back to them. This also means that in the same way that 5 10 years ago, it was important to have great audio. You really want to start talking and think about what you can do to take your video to the next level. Video gets dated very quickly. So, what is acceptable today could be laughable in a couple of years. And that's something we've been preaching to our clients. And you don't have to spend a huge fortune on it, but you have to be intentional. You have to be intentional on how you show up. And I guess that's my word. I can see, don't know if you can tell it with the DSLR camera. It might be a little bit out of focus, but intentional is what we are doing here. So let's talk for a second about one of the big lies in podcasting. Have you noticed that everyone is a Amazon best-selling author and everybody is a top 1% podcast? Now, I don't want to say that it's not true, but maybe people are just using the data in different ways. And this is one where I think it's very, very interesting. The truth is that depending what database you look at, somewhere between 3 and 4.5 million podcasts. That's true. Fact, right? But of those, less than 15% have actually published something in the last 30 days, right? There's something in the industry called pod fade. It's very easy to start a podcast. 80% of podcasts that die within the first 10 episodes. So do you compare yourself to the dead podcasts or to the active podcasts? And listen notes, if you go in there, it's got a little round ball with a question mark on it, and it will tell you this ranking is for all podcasts. So I always warn people if they're looking off of those numbers, well, all podcasts are in the top 15%. When we launched our show, the Podcast Interview Marketing Show, I saw what kind of downloads we got. And they were very low. We weren't even in the top half when we launched. But yet, when I went to listen notes, boom, we were in the top 10%. So just remember that when you're looking at these numbers, what are they really saying? Right. I wrote an article a number of years ago about this. And if you're listening to this right now, you can congratulate yourself because you're among the top 7% of best looking people, most aerobic, most athletic. And you say, how could that be? Well, it's because the 93% of people are dead. And you're like, well, it's not fair to judge yourself against dead people. Well, not fair to judge yourself against dead podcasts either. And in here, you can see, once again, what we talked about, the numbers right now. If you start a podcast and get one download, you're in the top 13.2% of podcasts. So just make sure, as a host, when you're putting out numbers, or as a guest, when you're looking, oh, this is a top whatever podcast, make sure that you're doing apples to apples, right? We always look at downloads per episode in the first 30 days. There's a couple of different databases that show that. One of them is Podchaser. Podchaser Pro, great database. We acquired their Connect unit last year in August. So what is a top podcast? And Libsyn hasn't updated these numbers in a while, but what they were saying is that to be a top podcast, you need to get at least 1,200 downloads per episode in the first 30 days, right? Average podcast was getting about 150. Top 1% gets about 36,000. So if somebody's telling you that they are in the top 1%, that should mean that they get 36,000 downloads per episode in the first 30 days, right? They could get long tail off of that of hundreds of thousands or millions. But when we're looking at it from a guest perspective, we're only looking at that first 30 days because that's really what you can measure and what you can impact there. So where's podcasting going? It's funny. There's been some articles on this, and they said by 2030, the majority of podcasts will be in Spanish language. And it sort of makes sense, right? English podcasting took off. It came very mature. It's still growing, but it's maturing. The markets that are growing the most are Spanish language podcasts, right? Spanish is the second largest language spoken in the world. So you would expect that. And we're really working on that with Interview Valet Espanol. Now, finally, Tiffany's got some different resources here that she can go into. And I'd like to make a quick little pitch too. And I don't like the word pitch, right? And this is a request. It's not an introduction. What's ordinary to you is amazing to others, right? So if you have your data, if you have any data, please share it with the world. Put it out there, because just the same way I was pulling numbers from Libsyn and numbers from PodPros and adding ours to it. When we all pool our data together, we all get so much smarter on this. Everybody's got an opinion, but when you get enough opinions together, then you've got some meaningful data.
As we always say, in God we trust, everyone else bring data. We all have opinions, but decisions should be based on data. You can download your own free copy of the 2024 State of Podcast Guesting at offers.interviewvalet.com/SOPG for State of Podcast Guesting, or over at podcastinterviewmarketing.com.